My name is Kenzie Woodbridge, and I'm excited to be talking to you today about three of the things that I love most: people, obscure academic theory, and technical documentation. All right, so in addition to having a decade-and-a-half-long IT career, I'm also a communications scholar and a researcher, and one of the great things in my academic field is the way we are encouraged to take a theory developed in one context and apply it to another, possibly completely unrelated context. And sometimes by doing this, we can find interesting congruences or receive new insights, and that's what we're going to do here today. But first, as is appropriate to my Canadian identity, I'm going to start with an apology, potentially. Aha. So as you can tell immediately, I'm not from here. So if at any point we're talking and I start sounding far more pseudo-Irish than I have any right to, scientists who study this phenomenon would tell you that I don't mean any harm, I probably like you and I'm not feeling awkward, and as it's a result of increased empathy and desire for understanding, but still I'm sorry and I'll try not to do that. So here's my plan. First, I'm going to give you a little real-life context for my work situation, so you can understand where I'm coming from, since that informs my interpretations here. Then I'm going to offer up a few caricatures of some of the folks you might find in any technical organization, whether it be a tech startup, longstanding software company, government or education, IT department, etc. I'll introduce you to player type theory and talk just a little bit about the history of online games. Then I'll try and connect it back to those folks that I introduced you to and to documentation. And I'll finish up by identifying some of the challenges and offering some possible solutions and strategies that this application of the theory suggests. Also, I hope to make you laugh if I can, because that's part of how I measure my value as a human being. No pressure. So, my context, and I'll try and keep this pretty brief. I work in the IT department, specifically web services, at the British Columbia Institute of Technology in Vancouver, BC, Canada. In my job, I wear many hats. I coordinate the support for our distributed web publishing community. I do a lot of internally focused technical training. I'm a community manager on our social intranet tool, but my favorite part of my job is administering my workplace's knowledge base and documentation. Where possible, I think we should always do our best to publicly acknowledge our biases. So here's one of mine. I think documentation is great. I love having things written down, and I'm a natural documenter of things in any job in which I find myself. Now, about BCIT, where I work, BCIT is British Columbia's second largest post-secondary institution. Every year, our faculty and staff support and teach specialty nursing, financial management, computer systems, aviation mechanics, carpentry, forestry, and on and on and on, to a student population about 5/8 the size of the population of Galway, actually. Just as I suspect is true for you in your workplaces, we have a lot of complexities. There are a lot of different people using a lot of different devices to access a lot of different services, software, processes, and so on. So what's one way to try and deal with complexity? Well, documentation, which then needs to cover that complexity and variety. So what you're looking at here is a word cloud that I created just from the titles of our public knowledge base articles. As you can see, it runs the gamut because RKB is there to support everyone. That's IT folks, but also faculty and staff, and also students. I'm not going to pretend to you even for a moment that our documentation is perfect. It is inevitably incomplete. But I have managed to convince my colleagues to fill a few gaps using some of the strategies that I'm going to suggest a little bit later. Documentation exists because it is created by people, for people. So I'm going to start by sketching out a few personas that I feel you will know pretty well. Just a word of explanation around naming. When I was writing this talk, I realized I didn't want to accidentally tie any negative characteristics to any particular ethnic group or gender or anything like that. So I decided to name my personae for cruciferous vegetables, because I love cruciferous vegetables. And of course, I'm going to use the singular they as the pronoun for everybody. So let's begin. Let's start with Sprout. Brussels Sprout, or Sprout for short, is an experienced support desk person They love their job because they enjoy helping people solve problems. They have a very good understanding of end users, including what users want to do and how well they can do it. Sprouts have significant general technical skill, but they are often person-helping specialists rather than technical specialists, though they can be both. I'm guessing that all of you know at least one Sprout, and I'm also guessing that some of you may even be Sprout. Anyone care to self-identify as a Sprout in the room? We're short on Sprouts today. All right, that's fine because we have others. How about Turnip? Turnip could be any number of different technical specialists, but for our purposes, let's say that Turnip is a server administrator, probably Linux. Definitely Linux. All right, Turnip loves knowledge, but Turnip does not like interacting with users. To Turnip, users exist to justify the existence and maintenance of servers. And my friend, those servers are beautiful, even if we are maybe not all equipped to appreciate that beauty. Turnips can sometimes find themselves being a bit openly dismissive of people who can't understand what a server configuration means just by looking at it. If you're not going to spend the hours that Turnip has spent learning everything there is to know about this, you don't really deserve to have the information handed to you on a plate. Sound familiar? Maybe even a little too familiar? I'm guessing a bunch of you Turnips are actually here in this room. Anyone care to self-identify? Oh, all right. Kale, how about Kale? Kale's very popular these days. Somehow if there are 15 projects on the go, Kale is always going to be right at the head of the most exciting and buzzwordy project. Kale led that responsive website redesign project back in 2008. Cloud storage project, look no further than Kale. Kale is knowledgeable enough to get her done, but that's not what motivates them. Kale likes to win at IT. In service of that, they know how and when to schmooze, and they show up at meetings when important people are there. They also dress a little better than everybody else. At the end of the project, their name is at the top of the incomplete list of deserving team members when the kudos get handed out in public. If Kale is on a project, that project must come in on time and on budget. Are there any Kales in the room? No? There's a Kale. All right, own it. And finally, broccoli. It's time to talk about broccoli, no matter how awkward it is to do so. Being a broccoli, I suggest, is more of a lifestyle than a technical role. Broccoli can actually have any number of roles in your organization, although usually they have at least a little bit of power. They could be a developer, project manager, server or database administrator, support desk coordinator, etc. It's often hard to pin down exactly how technically skilled broccoli is, or what their availability is, or what they're actually responsible for. They are often eager to get involved in projects, but then at some point they become a weird, unaccountable bottleneck. Broccoli is great at engineering a situation so that they're causing the problem, but you're the one who will be blamed. I certainly hope that you don't have a broccoli in your workplace, but I'm guessing that most of us have encountered such a person in our careers at least once. Any self-identified broccolis in the room? From experience, I know that you will come up and whisper to me that you think you might actually be a broccoli later, but that's fine. Now, some of you might be sitting there saying, hold on there, you led us down a garden path with your talk description. This is all vegetables and stereotypes. I'm here to see someone apply an outdated ludic research framework to documentation strategy. Don't worry, we're going to do that. So put up your hand if you know what a mud is and have ever played one. Right? Quite a few of you. For those of you who haven't, MUD stands for Multi-User Dungeon. MUDs are text-only online multiplayer games. Richard Bartle and Roy Trubshaw created one of the very first MUDs in 1978, which happens to be the year I was born. Their popularity likely peaked in the mid to late 90s, which is when I spent my time playing and creating in them, but there's still hundreds online and playable today. I heard of one just the other day that's been going on for over 20 years, and it's primarily used by blind players. Room descriptions aren't visual, but instead are tailored to the kind of sensory input that blind people would relate to, for example. It's a very flexible framework in which you can make many, many different kinds of games and worlds. The MUD that you see me inexpertly navigating above is actually a version of Bartle and Trubshaw's original MUD called MUD 2. It's still online and playable, and I recorded this just a few months ago. So what is player type theory? Well, in 1996, Richard Bartle, one of the original creators, published an article in which he describes 4 types of players differentiated by their motivations. The easiest way to explain the types is to sketch out a simple combinatory table. We only need 2 axes. One axis I'll mark as interact at one end and act on the other. I find it helps to think of this as interact with and act on. The other axis has players at one end and world at the other. Then each of the 4 quadrants is a combination of those 2 traits. So up at the top left, we have the combination of interact and players. These are the folks whom Bartle called socializers. They have fun by interacting, usually pleasantly, with other players in the game. They might play, but they're not playing to win or even to explore. It is the social interaction with other players that interests them. Then over here we have interact and world. These are explorers. They have fun by gaining in-depth knowledge of the game, its mechanics, and the environment. Though they might have the hard-won skill to beat the game, that's not really interesting to them. Finding hidden things or understanding game mechanics well enough to exploit them for their own uses is. Now down here we have act and world. Bartle named these players achievers, and they have fun by acting on the game world and beating the game. And then in the final quadrant, we have act and people. And Bartle, not one for mincing word, called these players killers. They have fun by acting on other players, often by disrupting their play, perhaps by killing their characters or destroying what they have built or collected. Now, those 4 are Bartle's player types. And in player type theory, Bartle suggests both a number of interactions and dynamics that occur between players of various types, and also suggests ways to design a virtual world to encourage or discourage various types in hopes of finding a stable equilibrium of players in the game. Caveat time. Before I go on, just in case any of you were starting to get itchy at the idea that there are somehow only 4 types of people in the world, I just want to reassure you, this is obviously a simplistic model, and our identities and motivations are inherently unstable. Bartle himself suggests that players may have different motivations in different contexts, or may indeed progress through all 4 of these over time. If applying a theory like this gives us a useful insight, then let's use it, but if it doesn't, we can just put it aside, okay? So, caveat time over. All right. Now, I was reading Bartle's article about player types, and I noticed something. Although Bartle was writing about playing a game and the kinds of things that motivate individuals to play it, he sure mentioned documentation an awful lot. And that's especially true when he talks about the difference between the top and bottom half of our combinatory, interact with versus act on. Bartle talks a lot about the difference between a game that you're designing specifically to satisfy explorers versus one that you're designing to satisfy achievers. For the most part, the difference between them relates to documentation one way or another. So here's an example. Emphasizing interacting over acting means designing for explorers, and Bartle says, make the help facilities produce vague information and produce cryptic hints when players appear stuck. Emphasizing acting over interacting means designing for achievers, and Bartle suggests providing a game manual and including automap and autolog facilities. And when I read this, it immediately struck me that this might offer a useful insight into a phenomenon that I frequently saw in my workplace. Perhaps you've seen this too. Not all of the time, but at least some of the time, some of the most specialized and expert people are also the people who write the least documentation. This has always puzzled me. But if those deep dive specialists are motivated in their work by discovery, by figuring things out, then having proper documentation actually takes all the fun and enjoyment out of that for them. So doing a difficult thing is only an engaging task worthy of their skills and attention if there isn't a walkthrough telling them each and every step along the way. They can work and even thrive in an environment with poor or no documentation because that makes it engaging and interesting. This made me start thinking about applying the model to my work environment. So let's go back to our combinatory again. I'm going to modify it just slightly for the workplace application. I'm going to leave interact and act just as they are, but I'm going to swap out players for users because I want to limit the scope. Then I'm going to swap out world for technology, since that's what we're all interacting with. So now let's bring back those personas that I talked about just a few minutes ago. You've probably already guessed from what I just said that I'm proposing that Turnip is an explorer because they like to interact with the technology. Sprout, who enjoys interacting with users, is a socializer. Kale, with their love of ending up on the top of the heap, is an achiever. And, yep, that makes Broccoli, the gatekeeper and weird subtle power player of the group, a killer. Okay, so what does this schema mean for technical documentation? Here's where I'm going to tell you another of my biases. I don't think documentation is something that only a technical writer should do. In fact, in a complex organization like the one I work for, and an organization is too small to hire a technical writer, it simply can't be limited to a specialist writer. We all can and should document at least some of the things we know, ideally most of the things we know, because it makes our own work and the work of our colleagues and clients easier and more efficient. So let's get to the meat of the talk. All right. Let's take a tour back through our cruciferous characters and talk about how each of the types is likely to approach documentation and what challenges that might create. Then I'm going to highlight some strategies that are suggested by player type theory that have worked for me. So Sprouts first. I'm going to suggest to you that since Sprouts focuses on users and meeting user needs, the Sprouts of the world they actually often love documentation because it helps them solve a user's problem quickly and without missteps. They can send a resource that lets the user do self-help, or they can step through it with them in person or on the phone. Documentation also allows Sprout to maintain their broad technical experience and knowledge, and they tend to give back to it. As a support desk worker in a team, Sprout also often wants to support their colleagues in solving user problems. If, for example, Sprout figures out a workaround that isn't documented, they will typically document it. In fact, in my experience, Sprout is a natural documenter. And if Sprout is working in a place without a central documentation repository, or if they are prevented from easily contributing to it, they will be the person with 40 Word documents on their desktop that they can quickly email to a user in need. In player type theory, Bartle explains that without sufficient socializers in the community, a game's player base will inevitably dwindle. That's because within a game environment, socializers provide an appreciative and companionable audience for explorers and achievers, and reactive play for killers. So without them, other player types are less likely to want to play in the environment. A work environment, of course, isn't the same as a game environment. Workers have less freedom to just physically leave if they're bored or put upon. But I'd suggest that they can still stop or reduce their engagement with the work even while they keep showing up. So Sprouts are important and even pivotal contributors. They can be incredible documentation allies, but because of their connection to users and the perception that they are less technically skilled, which may well not be true, they're often not given much respect from other types, in my experience. I suggest a two-front approach, personal support and public support. Under personal support, first, and this actually applies to every type to a greater or lesser degree, I suggest that you can never go wrong with a structured template. Nothing aggressively and intimidatingly stares down a potential documenter like a completely blank document. Second, and this could also apply to each type, I suggest that some non-judgmental assistance with editing and publishing could be useful. If you are lucky enough to have a specialist writer or a KB administrator like me on the team, then that kind of support is just a natural part of the role. If not, a buddy system could be a good strategy, or social group documentation sprints, or a culture of folks being second reader for each other. You also need to support Sprouts in public and include them where they're being needlessly excluded. Become the local Sprout ambassador. Don't let anyone speak ill or be dismissive of a Sprout in your presence. Talk about the good work they do, the documentation they write, their expertise and knowledge of users, their user empathy, etc. Thank them for the work they do publicly in front of others, and include them. If you're in project meetings and there's never anyone there who supports users in using the thing you're building, ask why not. Ask it often. Get those people in the room because they know things that developers and administrators and project managers don't know. Basically, what I'm saying is that if you care about documentation, Sprouts are your natural allies, and if they're being dismissed, forgotten, excluded, or discounted, your documentation is going to be worse, your workplace culture is going to be less engaging and enjoyable, and supporting your user community is going to be a lot harder. As an explorer, moving on to turnips, Turnip is motivated by knowledge, and they like to have the freedom to explore. Learning and exploring are so central to a turnip's motivations that they can take precedence over achieving a project goal on a specific timeline. This can cause conflict. For example, something that I hear a lot from the turnips in my department, whom, to be clear, I love, is that they don't want to tell users best practices or guidelines for how to use a tool because the tool is flexible, and users should spend a bit of time exploring it and figuring out how they want to use it. Sound familiar? Anyone here? Most of the users that I support want a clearly delineated process and best practice laid out for them to follow because their technology use is not a game and it is not for fun. It's in service to a different goal or purpose, and their time to engage with it is limited. Now, combine this with the fact that what turnips have and what they respect is deep technical knowledge. And you can see how this introduces tension into a workplace where there can naturally be a significant difference in technical skill level between different people. Turnips tend to be quick to judge others by their own expectations. This means that for turnips, folks who aren't interested in exploring the technology for themselves aren't busy people with a lot of work to get through in a day. Instead, they're simply wildly inferior turnips. So turnips, I suggest, are actually natural anti-documenters. If a turnip does document something, I would suggest that it is likely to be reminiscent of the quote I already showed you, cryptic hints that only another similarly skilled turnip could parse. And of course, when this documentation doesn't appear to stop people asking them inconvenient and annoying questions, they tend to give up pretty easily on the whole docs concept. So here's my advice. If your goal is documentation that is correct and detailed, then the folklore contained in a turnip's brain is your holy grail. Because they're not naturally inclined to document things, and because they're busy doing important work, your documentation process may need to be altered to accommodate them, but this is generally worth doing. To get those docs out of them, first you need to reframe documentation for them. Get them to think about documentation as perhaps showing off their expertise to others, proving that they are in fact knowledgeable. Then remind them that good documentation can be used to reduce interruptions in their life from users. This means that culturally you need to back them up and maybe sending users to the docs first and insisting that they try to read them before asking for further help. And third, you could reframe documentation as yet another thing for a turnip to be knowledgeable and expert in. Then you need to support their writing efforts. First, you'll need to reduce the barriers that stand in their way, provide templates, help with publishing, do whatever you need to do to get their knowledge out of their head and onto the page because it is worth it. This means that at least some of the time, you may also need to figure out how to help them either do it yourself or get someone to help them edit or rewrite some of their documentation for the users. We all get to choose the hills we're willing to die on, of course, but I'd suggest that winning the fight on consistent use of the Oxford comma with a turnip is not a good use of your time, especially if it prevents them from getting what they know out in an accessible form. All right. Next, kale. How does kale relate to documentation? It really depends on how it fits into what they're trying to achieve, because remember, achieving great things is what kale loves best. This means that if documentation is part of the criteria that will be used for evaluating the success of a project, it will be a priority for them. Otherwise, it won't. As a documenter, I would suggest that kales are often opportunists. They will happily reuse or repurpose existing documentation, which can be positive or negative, depending on the quality. Kale is into big bang launches, because that's where the accolades are, but not so much into incremental improvement or long-term maintenance and support. They're more dev than DevOps, right? As documenters, kales are inconsistent in my experience. And of course, unless producing documentation is enforced as mandatory for the success of a project, it will fall off a kale's radar. In my experience, kales can be great documenters, but only if you catch them at just the right moment in a project. First, you want to literally gamify documentation for them. One way to do that is to literally post the stats on who's doing the doc writing. Who wrote the most or most visited this week, this month, or this year? Who has the greatest proportion of current reviewed docs, and so on. Kale likes to have their name in lights, so maybe consider making the author of docs visible in some fashion, although I admit that this might not be desirable in all circumstances. Of course, the biggest gamification strategy I'd suggest is to not let writing documentation be an optional side quest. Having user support docs in place, or even internally focused docs in place before launch needs to be a critical success criteria in your projects. There's probably a whole other half-hour talk contained in just that one bullet, I acknowledge. Once you have them concerned with documentation, you need to support that achievement. One piece of advice I'd offer is to be available on short notice. Where I work, I know that about a week before the launch date of a major project, Kale is going to come with me and ask me to edit and publish their 15 docs. I could quite reasonably tell them to organize their work better and that their poor planning is not my crisis, but the reality is they likely won't change. And if what I want is documentation, here it is. And accommodating them now gets me their gratitude and further commitment to documentation in the future. Once again, templates are great. Achievers will use them, and it'll make your short notice rush jobs easier to get through. Public kudos are important. Thank them in front of others, especially in front of the folks whose judgments matter to their career or other projects. Back to broccoli. I'm going to suggest that in addition to their other difficult traits, broccolis are often predictably terrible at documentation. Not because of a lack of ability, but because information is power, so controlling information is also power. If something is well documented, it makes it possible for others to avoid broccoli's power plays. For example, if broccoli is in charge of the weird legacy software that your organization inexplicably still depends on, it will likely be pretty badly documented, because then everybody has to go through broccoli and they can indulge their desire for power over others. Paradoxically, however, if broccolis haven't managed to consolidate sole ownership of the technology, or if documentation is considered laudatory in your organization, broccoli may be motivated to occasionally add to the existing documentation when doing so lets them show up a coworker in front of others. I promise you, however, that they will never, ever review or update it, ever. Broccolis are inconsistent documenters and elements of destructive chaos. They are not, to put too fine a point on it, bullies. I sincerely hope that you are not having to deal with broccolis, frankly, but if you are and there's no way to get those people off your project, then player type theory does suggest a few strategies you can use. First, you want to protect yourself, not just because these strategies can help with actually getting documentation done, they potentially can, but because, and I'm not joking now, work matters, your experience of it matters, and you are worth protecting. So only talk to them in public. Don't let them collar you in a quiet hallway and make commitments for which there are no witnesses. Document everything. If you do have a verbal conversation about a project, follow up with an email in which you reiterate what everyone committed to. And Bartle also just suggests that explorers are the natural enemy of killers, so get a turnip involved. They know enough to keep broccolis in line and to pierce through their lies, right? So they have the knowledge that can be a good defense there. Then you need to go forward with documentation projects as though it were completely reasonable to do so. Too often, workplace bullies are permitted to act with impunity because people would rather accept their bad behavior and avoid conflict than acknowledge how damaging it is. But if you are able to confront it, you need to do it safely. It's dangerous out there because of broccolis. So since swords aren't work appropriate, don't go it alone. Have allies who also know what's going on with this person. Then, even though everything isn't normal, you should still act in public as though it was. What I mean by that is treat commitments they make as though they are real and be surprised in public if they don't fulfill them. Follow up in writing, and in public on commitments that they have made, and expect accountability. Escalate the problem to someone with more power than you if you need to, and since you've been documenting everyone, you can do it convincingly. Privately expect delays and power plays, but don't tolerate them or engage with them. And for extra credit, turn their destructive tendencies in a more useful direction. Sometimes a broccoli acts the way they act because of frustration and cynicism. If you can empower them to use their killer instincts on behalf of the project against delays and barriers rather than against their coworkers, you might just do everyone a huge favor. So that's my talk. Here's the too long didn't read. Applying academic theory to your work can offer interesting insights and also be fun. Crucifers are tasty, but more importantly, support and advocate for sprouts. They're great, and naturally you're on side with documentation. Reframe documentation for turnips, then support their writing of it, making it as painless as you can. It's worth doing. Gamify documentation for kales and, no pressure. Successfully advocate for documentation as critical success criteria in your projects. And finally, protect yourself from broccolis and don't normalize their bad behavior. Thank you so much. I've got actually a minute or two for questions, but I also wanted to let you know, just for fun, I have made cruciferous people stickers, so I encourage you to come and ask me for them later on.